small conference on literature, which is organized by Subverzive Festival in Croatia with Flemish Band Center. Our guests today on our fourth panel are Dasha Drnić, Sasha Čilić, and Peter Temer. I'm very happy that we have one of the most interesting, I think, panel today, because our topic today will be confronting the past. So, Dasha and Peter will have their speech in English, Sasha will have his speech in Serbian, and we are waiting for translators, so Sasha will be the third one.
How many foreigners are there here? How many people who don't understand Croatian or Serbian or what? One?
One is enough.
No. Majority win.
My Croatian is not so...
So I'll think since there's only one person who doesn't understand, so I'll think
there's another one.
Where is it? That's the same one. He multiplies.
So, did we have that, Peter? I have nothing that we started in Croatian and then that you understand Croatian and Serbian? A little bit?
Somebody will come to translate.
I can get sort of the general thing, but the details are only...
Okay.
It's alright if someone can summarize some of
yes.
the
Okay.
translations.
So when translator comes, then we just switch on. So, I would like to start with Dasha Drnić, okay? Because she's my author and we know each other very well. And Dasha Drnić is one distinguished author with a lot of books, and in all of her books she converted the past with Dasha Drnić. One of her books, Suočavanje, is now the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize, shortlisted. So, and in that book, which is called in English Trieste, in Croatian and all other languages Suočavanje, she goes deep into the Second World War and had all of those things that she would like to know about what is bystanders, how they converting in the past and what they done. So, but I will give the mic to Dasha and she will start.
Ja ću samo kratko sad, jer onda ćemo svi pomalo pa onda poslije se suočavati. Naravno. Po ovom pitanju suočavanje, u ovoj konstataciji suočavanja s prošlošću, naravno, se zna riječ je suočavanje. Prošlost po meni zapravo i postoji, jer prošlost je, a sad, kako tako? Da, jer prošlost zapravo ne postoji, jer ako se sama ne probija na neki način u sadašnjost, onda čovjek za njom traga. I doslovno i metaforički za njom traga. I iskopava, ruje, ne bi na neki način dešifrirao sebe i svoje postojanje. Tako da, sama činjenica da razmišljamo o prošlosti sada To znači da prošlost nije nestala, da je tu. Prema tome, postoje načini da ta prošlost nestane, jedino ako mi svojevoljno...
When we talk about something past,
You want me to translate?
No, sorry. We'll wrap my hand. And talking about history, we can conclude that history is not something that doesn't exist. The very fact that we're talking about it is a life.
To give you a brief summary, but
Okay, I'll try. I have my notes in French, I'll try and speak in English, okay. I think the past is really here all the time. So whenever we think about something that is past, and we are in the so-called present, that means that the past is still here. Unless, of course, we have these voluntary Alzheimer spaces that cover up that which we do not want to remember. So the function of one of the functions of art in general, not only literature, is to fish out, literally with a fishing rod, to hook out these patches of the past, and to bring them and to bring people face to face with these little islands of the past, in order to make it easier for them to sort of live healthier lives. So that would be just a little bit enough.
Thank you, Dasha. So I will now give the word to Sasha, and I would like that Sasha also have some brief introduction what is first his part, because Sasha is one of the editor of the best on literary magazine, who is all the time referred to the past.
Svega hvala. Nisam želeo da vas maltretiram svojim engleskim, ne bih uspio da izrazim ono što sam hteo.
I didn't want to mistreat you in my English, I wouldn't be able to express what I wanted to say.
Ali govorit ću kraće.
And I'll keep short.
Kao jedan od urednika Betona, koji je dodatak dnevnih novina, taj dodatak postoji već 7 godina i posvećen je dekonstrukciji nacionalističkog nasleđa u Srbiji i u takozvanom regionu.
The magazine Bethlehem, which is an addition to the daily news, is dedicated to confronting issues of deconstructing national discourse and history. Right?
Yes, in Serbia and so-called region.
Yes, Serbia.
Dakle, mi smo osnovani 2006. I to je godina kada je rat već gotovo 11 godina, ili u odnosu na ono što se dešavalo na Kosovu 7 godina, i postavlja se pitanje zašto toliko vremena posle završetka rata govoriti i o tim temama i o nasleđu, da li je to već završeno, odnosno da li mi uzimamo metaforično mrtvaca iz groba i nešto radimo sa njim.
Subverzive started in 2006, which was considerably many years after the war, 7 years after the war in Kosovo, and the question is why they take so long to talk about it. Are you just exhuming the graves? We're talking about inheritance, corpses, we're talking about issues of inheritance.
Takozvano suočavanje s prošlošću je jedna važna tema koju smo mi od početka imali, nastavljajući ono što su radile mnoge nevladine organizacije 90-ih i mnoge opozicijone političke stranke stranke iz tog perioda i perioda kasnije, razvijajući neke pretpostavke za takozvanu demokratizaciju i stvaranje građanskog društva.
So, talking about issues of confronting history is something that many non-governmental organizations were discussing in the opposition parties in the 1990s.
Sa druge strane, to nasleđe spadale su i optužbe, odnosno etikete, namenjene onima, to je dosta slično i u Hrvatskoj, koji su se protivili nacionalističkoj politici, posebno je ona bila opasna u Srbiji, dakle, da su jednostavno strani plaćenici. To je zanimljiva, komplikovana tema, zato što naravno da je stizala pomoć iz inostranstva, ne u onom iznosu kako su i sami donatori objavljivali, jer je jednostavno bilo nemoguće suočiti se sa jednim takvim režimom samostalno, bez organizacije i bez novčane podrške, ali što je prvo polje za manipulacije i za jednu ovakvu etiketu.
So, one of the problems facing this discussion of the past is the accusations that they were foreign mercenaries in some ways, that they were, because they were receiving money from abroad, that they were, representing sort of kind of foreign ideas, which is a problem not only in Serbia, where nationalism took a very kind of dangerous turn, but it's also a problem here in Croatia as well.
Problem sa betonom, kad smo mi krenuli, da tih para jednostavno nije bilo.
Problem with when they started that money just wasn't there in the first place.
Ali svejedno mi smo nastavili i sad dolazimo do ove sintagme šta znači suočavanje s prošlošću i da li nam je ono i dalje potrebno ili je već deplasirano.
So,
we come to the syntax where what is confront the past or not?
we have to see whether that issue is something that we should be talking about confronting the past, or if it's outdated.
Ja mislim da je prvo značenje ove sintagme zapravo saznati istinu o prošlosti, saznati činjenice koje su se dogodile, i tu se postavlja pitanje, zar mi te činjenice i tu istinu ne znamo.
The important thing is to
do a brief summary.
Moje mišljenje je da mi to istinu možemo znati, postoje sve pretpostavke, postoje mediji, postoje izvori informacija i oni koji žele da znaju tu istinu imaju mogućnosti da dođu do činjenica i da sklope celokupnu sliku o tome šta se dešavalo od početka 90-ih, raspada zemlje, ratova na ovim prostorima, ratnih zločina, političkih ideologija koje su ih generisale, posledica tih ratova i na kraju odnosa svih aktera na sceni prema njima. Dakle, sve tu dato. Čemu onda suočavanje, čemu insistiranje na toj istini. Kada krenemo od nečega što je mainstream, medijski, politički, ideološki, recimo da se zadrži kontekstu Srbije poslednjih 20 godina, shvatamo da iako su te činjenice prisutne, iako većina stanovništva može da sklopi, ukoliko to želi, istinu o prošlosti, to se jednostavno ne dešava. Imamo tri faze ili 3 metoda odnosa prema činjenicama koji su se smenjivali, a ponekad istovremeno postojali na sceni. To je naravno negiranje, odnosno odbijanje da se nešto desilo, pre sve da mislim na masovne zločine koje je počinila naša strana, to je strana koja pripada narod iz čije perspektive ili većina stanovništva govori. Druga je, naravno, relativizacija i oni su činili isto. Dakle, na neki način uspostavlja se jednakost u počinjenim zločinima, ali se i relativizuje ono što je učinila vlastita strana. I na kraju je ono najgore što se javlja, to dodatno najgore kod mlađe generacije, a to je i nekad se to desilo, ta druga strana je zaslužila. I tu se onda postavlja pitanje celokupnog sistema vrednosti, pa i sistema na kome bi trebalo da počiva naša civilizacija. Da li je to hrišćansko ljubi, da li je to poštuje onog drugog, odnosno živi sa njim, mako bio taj drugi, od etničkog do seksualnog opredeljenja. Je tada je prihvaćena u Zagrebu, nekako je prošlo u Splitu, u Beogradu još nije, ali naravno i to će se nekad desiti, ali taj drugi nije prihvaćen. Dakle, kada postoji veliki otpor da se prihvate činjenice i neprijatne istine, onda je potrebno u ovom smislu suočavanja s prošlošću suočiti se sa političkim, medijskim mainstreamom i posebno sa onim što se, to je zapravo i najteža posledica ratova, etabliralo kroz obrazovni sistem, udžbenike iz istorije nacionalnog jezika, nova istina koja kreće sa preispisivanjem prošlosti od Drugog svjetskog rata preko 90-ih do danas, i to predstavlja dobru podlogu za ksenofobiju, isključivanje drugog, repatrijarhalizam društva i, naravno, uspon u krajnjoj liniji ne samo desnice, nego i ekstremnih vidova desnice. I neko, možda ne najvažnije, ali na kraju značenje suočavanja s prošlošću jeste stvarati osetljivost kako u akademskoj sredini, tako i kod običnog sveta za jedno suptilnije i obuhvatnije razumevanje prošlosti, uključivanje isključenih, odnosno marginalnih, bilo to ženska perspektiva, bilo to gej perspektiva ili perspektiva nekih drugih neprimećenih grupa i razumevanje i onih aspekata i prošlosti i njenog tumačenja koji idu van manihejskih podjela i van opredeljivanja čak i onog da je do 90-ih bilo sve dobro i prihvatljivo, zaboravljajući na autoritarne ili totalitarne crkve tog režima, gušenje slobode samo zato što je 90-ih došlo do masovnih zločina. Dakle, suočavanje s prošlošću je pre svega jedan profesionalni imperativ istoričara i pripadnika ekonomističkih nauka, onda jedan etički odgovor, insistiranje na sistemu vrednosti koji je prihvatljiv za građansko i demokratsko društvo i na njemu počiva, i na kraju to je jedan politički stav suprotstavljanja svim onim strankama, grupama, pokretima koji jednostavno dovode u pitanje uspostavljanje i funkcionisanje ovakvog sistema vrednosti, tako da to nije samo posao ni za stranke, ni za istoričare, nego za sve građane, za sve aktiviste, za sve koji misle i žele dobro svom društvu, i da ne govorimo o odnosu između naših država, tako da ta potreba, ma koliko ovaj pojam bio zlorabljen ili već pauperizovan značenja, mislim da s ovim dimenzijama ima i dalje nekog smisla.
Hvala, Saša. Ja ću kratko sažeti, I will try to summarize very shortly. So Sasha talked a lot on converting the past and what does it mean in contemporary Serbia, but not only in contemporary Serbia, but in all countries in the region, in a way, but also we can tell, and that when I give the mic to the Peter, so he will talk about it in Europe, I hope. That is, Sasha start with what is the worst with today, that there is three phases of talking about the past. The first one is negotiation, rejection of what one side done in the war or in the ex-Yugoslavia in the 90s, together with mass killing and so on. The second is relativization, because the other side has done the same. And the third one is, and the worst one, is with the younger generation, especially. It is good that it happened, and because the other side has deserved that. And then he talked about how did we came to that point. That is what does it fact means for us. How can we convert with the facts which are done in the 90s with the political and media mainstream? What all of those things has done to us, and is that the true fact or not? But the worst problem with that is not only the political and media mainstream, but the biggest problem is education system, which is putting the new truth in the education materials, in history and mother tongue lessons. Sorry. So all of that came that we have a generation with a lot of xenophobia, with a lot of problems that does not recognize those so-called others or marginalized persons and minorities in society. So I will very briefly summarize, because Sasha talked a little bit more, and I will now give the podium to the Peter. Peter is one of the leading historians in, I just forgot the name of your books, historian in the Belgium and in Dutch-speaking world, with specialists in the Central European Eastern Europe themes. He has written 2 academic books, The Romani Movement, Minority Politics and Ethnic Mobilization in Contemporary Central Europe, and The Peace Front, which is Heftet Forum. I don't know the Dutch so good. He's very much into Flemish pen, and also he's editor of Letters to Europe, which was published on Passaporta, and that is a collection of essays about Europe from writers from all over the world. So I would like Peter just brief introduction on our theme. Text, and I then would like to go back to all of you because that we start talk about about converting the past during the 20th century, during the literature in the 20th century, and all of what happened in the 20th century start with World War II.
Thank you. So, thinking about literature and art more generally, on the one hand, and history and the past on the other hand, I've always thought there's a particular tension between two phenomena, two tendencies perhaps. So on the one hand, sort of the importance of trying to tell the truth, or searching for the truth, and to make that historical truth a topic of writing and of art and of literature more general. Very important in case of a situation where there are important historical national myths that need to be deconstructed, or when there's a traumatic history that needs to be talked about. So that's the one hand. On the other hand, that sometimes stands in tension with a commemorative impulse which is so overpowering that it stifles the creative action, and that it stifles the writing. So there's somehow a need in literature and art also to overcome some of that searching for truth and searching for the past. Somehow to forget it and to move on and to look in other directions. Because the commemorative impulse can be very stifling for it. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking in particular of an animation movie that I saw a few years ago by an American animation movie maker and comics author, Ben Ketchor, which is about like a 15-minute movie about a town that commemorates everything. So if a street, if a car runs over a dog or an elderly lady dies in the street, immediately a monument is placed there. If someone has a heart attack somewhere, another monument is placed there to commemorate the heart attack. And of course, after 15 minutes, there's no town anymore. There's only monuments, and so the town is in fact dead. So there's this tension, and of course, I think historians very much have the task of searching for the right path and trying to. This is their task to try to find out what is the truth and do this as honest as they can. And I'm not a historian, I'm a social scientist, but I have a lot of sympathy for historians who try to do this important task in an honest way. I think writers and artists, it's a bit different perhaps. On the one hand, I think they have to engage and address history, certainly when they feel that it's very important to the context where they find themselves. But sometimes it can be very destructive for their art if they are swallowed up by the dynamics of searching for the truth, and if they end up in a discussion which leads them far away from their art. And I think somewhat some of the solutions, maybe not a solution, but a way to deal with that sort of tension could be to focus for writers, I think, on stories. And stories can be extremely important in telling history, but also changing people's minds about history, or shedding another light in history, reframing the history, pointing out important aspects of it that have not been part of the discussion, and so on and so forth. And they can do that, I think, in creative and unexpected ways. And that's the power, I think, of writers. Stories can be very powerful in reframing history, or opening up the dialogue about history in another way that the dialogue already exists. So actually making the terrain broader, the terrain of discussion more broader. I think I want to just give one example of something that happened in Belgium recently, and that we as a Pen Center were involved in doing, which sort of goes in that direction. The example is the following. We met, or we know a sculptor in Belgium. He's now in his early 80s, who was a child during the Second World War, and he lived as a child in a family which collaborated with the Nazi regime. This was a very strange environment to grow up in as a kid. So he also, after the war, went to Germany, very complicated history. After his family was then afterwards in jail and so on. And like, a large part of his adult life has been how to deal with this terrible, terrible past that his family was so guilty in collaborating in this murderous regime. On the other hand, we also knew of a Jewish boy, who actually was a boy during the war, who had been in a Belgian concentration camp, and was on a train to Auschwitz rather towards the end of the war, and this was the only train that has been stopped, blocked by people who tried to liberate the people who were on the train. This boy was on the train with his mother, and his mother eventually, so the train stopped for a while when they were attacking it, but then continued to move on. The mother eventually died in Auschwitz. But the boy escaped. So he must have been 8 years old. He ran into the woods and escaped, and actually was the only surviving person from his family, and lived with that history, and during his adult life had to deal with that and wrote books about it and so on and so forth. Now, these two people, the child from the Nazi family, the child from the Jewish family who was killed, they met each other. And they talked about their histories, their struggles, how they dealt with their past, and they became friends. And they thought they had a message to tell to the world, that they were individuals that had to deal with this troublesome past, as individuals have to deal with troublesome pasts anywhere else. And so on the International Literature Festival, the Boston Festival in Brussels last month, we organized a session where these two elderly persons at this point met each other. Well, they had already met, but they publicly talked and shared their story with the audience. And they also wrote about it, and so the Jewish boy, now man, wrote about it, and the sculptor did some artwork and drawings about that history, and it's become a book, a very powerful, very emotional book. And I think this is something we can do as a Penn Center. This is sort of literature, but even more than that. It's also opening up the conversation and trying to bring in people from the Belgian society who wouldn't necessarily talk so much anymore about that history, but it's still very alive in the background and on a lot of people's mind, because we see of the responses that have come from the audience. So I think that's a beautiful example of what a Penn Center could do in sort of bringing up the past, but at the same time show, don't tell. So we're not going to do a study about that period, we as writers. That's for historians to do. But we can tell and help to tell these personal stories of these people during this traumatic history. So I think I will stop my comments here, and perhaps we can move on to questions and debate after that.
Thank you, Peter. So you just put few very important things. So the story, which is behind, as Dasha had in her book, the story is behind every person. So you have to tell these stories, and writers are the one who need to tell the stories in proper way that could be reached to the bigger audience. I would like to now ask first Dasha, and then maybe all of you, what happened, and that is something that we all saw during our in ex-Yugoslavia, but I think also in most of the Europe, when after the all traumatic experience, like the wars, like Second World War, that everything is put under the carpet, and after 20, 30, 40 years, all of those characters came out, like in ex-Yugoslavia, with the big problems. What is, not mission, but what is, how writers can convert that, how can, or artists, how can they go deep to it and bring it to the audience, to the people, just to, so what would happen if you are not talking about the problematic issue.
Last night we had a discussion about engaged literature, so I don't know whether it's the place to repeat all this that we talked about for 2 hours last night. What is engaged literature and how one writes literature that is at the same time in a way engaged, because everything one writes is engaged in one way or another, and at the same time that which one writes remains some kind of art. So I don't know whether I should go into this, but I was sort of triggered by something that you said. This practice of confronting two sides, it's been going on since the end of the Second World War, and there have been psychiatric, psychoanalytical, social groups who practice this with individuals from different sides confronting each other, or groups. So much has been done since the end of the Second World War, and is still going on for the purpose of healing this heavy and deadly trauma, really, either on an individual basis or on a collective. Many books have been written on the trauma. There is on these war trauma. You mentioned historians. There's a problem with historians because, unfortunately, and that we witnessed here in Croatia, historians are also politically biased. And there are on the one side you have historians that will investigate that which will please those in power, momentarily in power, and then on the other hand you have so-called independent historians. So the only way, of course, to confront the past is to tell the truth. But then again, this whole thing of the truth becomes shaky. Of course, as you said, Sasha said, it's a question of ethics. So that's something that one should deal with by himself or herself. When Sasha mentioned the 3 phases of confronting the past, I sort of immediately remember those are the 3 phases that one goes through when one is confronted with a serious illness. It's the same when the doctor tells you that you have cancer, for example. The first reaction is rage, and then the second one is gradual acceptance, and then the third phase is probably some kind of struggle for your own benefit. So if we look at it this way, we'll see that the past can be a deadly disease unless it is revealed and dealt with. I don't know, you want me to talk about literature? In principle, I'm very much against stories in literature. I'm not stories as stories themselves, but I'm against plots in literature. I don't think that the literature that I consider is more or less good literature. I don't think it should be linear. I don't think it has to have. I don't think the plot, the story, has to dominate. What we talked about it last night. Literature is not what is said, but how it is said. So in literature you have style, which I think is number one in evaluating work of written art, and then you have fragments. I'm really obsessed in, if we want to talk about literature, I'm obsessed in the structure of by the structures of literary works, because I think that we don't live linear lives, we don't live simple lives. We have memories, we have flashbacks, we have emotions, we have our conscious, our subconscious, and we have sparks we have visions of some kind. So our whole life is fragmented, and I see our life as little patches of events that we knowingly or unknowingly sometimes more masterful, sometimes in a more laid way, patched, sewn together. And it is this patchwork that really makes up our lives. So why should literature be alive? In fact, that's not a simplification of our lives, which are much more complex than a large number of literary works that are mediocre, really. In dealing with trauma has been going on really since the end of the Second World War. In 1955, the American sociologist Milton Mayer, he published a book, They Thought They Were Free. And it was a book about the German people who accepted the Third Reich. Because they thought that the policy of National Socialism would bring them some kind of freedom. And then came the problem of confronting the results of this 10-year period. Then in the late 60s, a couple, husband and wife, they were psychoanalysts, they published a book, The Inability to Mourn, and they compared this trial of these attempts to overcome trauma with the mourning of the loss of a close or loved person. So they talked about it being a process which one has to voluntarily go through in order to continue living a relatively normal life. So the basic I think of the basic action in overcoming a trauma, first you have to realize that there is a trauma, is that of confronting, dealing with the truth. I read recently an article, an interview with a psychologist, Vladan Beara. He works in Novi Sad, and the interviewer asked him, what in this region does the revival of the trauma of the Second World War mean to you? And then, I'm going to read it now. He talks about transgenerational trauma. I will read it in whichever one of the languages gracious is. U kliničkoj psihologiji i psihijatriji postoji pojam transgeneracijski prenos traume, kada jedna traumatizirana generacija prenosi traumu na sljedeću. Potrebno je nekoliko generacija da prva trauma, recimo ona iz Drugog svjetskog rata, nestane. I onda nastavlja u dijelovima Hrvatske, Bosne i Srbije. Danas ćete slušati priče kako oni rade sa traumatiziranih dijelova bivše Jugoslavije. Slušat ćete priče kako su ovi ili oni klali one druge u Drugom svjetskom ratu, dakle prije 70 godina. Djeca odgajana na strašnim pričama o tom ratu bila su među prvima koja su pohrlila u ratove 90. Sebe su smatrala odvetnicima tih prošlih ratova. U tom je smislu tipičan stav srpskih ratnih veterana iz posljednjih ratova prema hrvatskim kolegama. Što god mi vama učinili danas, ničim nam ne možete platiti ono što ste vi nama učinili jučer. So, that's the problem. That's why it is very important to deal with trauma, and because it is transgenerational. And then there is also a large number of books written by sons and daughters of the Nazis who are trying to sort of absolve their fathers or deal with their fathers' past. Some of them protect their fathers, some of them condemn them. So much has been done. The question that disturbs me is how much has been done in Croatia. And I don't think in these past 70 years there was sort of continuous work on the subject, we might say. And that is not only, as Sasha says, the business of non-governmental organizations and civil society. That is the duty of those in power. That is the duty. That should be the strategy of those who have power, of the government. And that's what I think is not happening, and had not happened in the past in Yugoslavia, and is not happening even today. On the 4th of May, in Široki Brijeg, uklonjen spomenik antifašizmu. Bagar uklonio kameni cvijet, spomenik poznati kao Titina ruža, izgrađen u vreme Jugoslavije. The 4th of May. A monument to the Second World War was blown up. 10 years ago. Sada. So what are we talking about? Where are we here? Imamo priču recimo o mojoj...
Thank you, Dasha. So you now open a lot of things, and I would like to go to the Sasha and one thing that you put it on, which is, I think, very good collaborate with that generation from Sasha talked about. It is about the people holding power. It is about educational system. What can educational system, what has educational system done during the ex-Yugoslavia? Because you have only one view and a lot of issues which happened, wasn't talked about on the one side, and now you have the problem with the new generations, but I think this is not only a problem in ex-Yugoslavia, but all over the Europe, because with the latest statistics, you saw that like 30% of German young students think that Hitler was a good person, he was democratic. So you have like really big problems, not only here but all over the Europe, and I would like that Sasha talk a little bit about that and what can be intellectuals done on how can we do something in that case.
Nisam siguran za Nemce. Čini mi se da je ovdje problem u tome što raspadom Jugoslavije i ratovima su nastale države sa vladajućim elitama, možda i vladajućim većinama, koje su jednostavno odlučile da zaborave zajedničku prošlost i da ponište ili omalovaže, obezvrede ono što je bilo vredno. Mislim da su kriterijumi za ovo što govorim, možete uporediti sa svojim stavovima, mišljenjem, odnos prema tom smislu zajedničkog nasleđa, antifašističkoj borbi, jugoslavijskom kulturnom i prostoru jednog posebnog socijalističkog društvenog sistema. I to je jezička bliskost i pitanje jezika i na kraju to je naravno pitanje identiteta. Paradoksalno u Srbiji je da tek posle pada Miloševića zapravo dolazi do porasta nacionalizma i konstruisanja jednog novog identiteta i provlačenja tog diskursa i tumačenja i prošlosti i savremenosti kroz udžbenike i medije, forsiranje nacionalnih simbola i zapravo činjenicu da te takozvane demokratske elite uzimaju nacionalizam kao zlatnu podlogu, crvenu nit svog djelovanja i svoje ideologije i to je jedan blagi nacionalizam koji se gotovo i podrazumeva. Tako da, ja mislim da je prvi odgovor da treba da postoji konsenzus u tumačenju prošlosti, pre svega na nivou političkih elita, jer tu, ako svaki ima svoje favorite u aktorima istorijske prošlosti, ako ih neko vidi na onoj poraženoj strani, koja je bila kolaborantska, a ideološki često i fašistička, a jedan drugi deo ili manjina u Srbiji nalazi za svoje pretke kojima odaje poštovanje partizanima, onda je to definitivno ili u najboljem slučaju opisni konflikt, gurnut pod tepih, a svakako izvor novih konfliktata sada ili u bliskoj budućnosti. Kada se uspostavi taj konsenzus, kao što recimo u Hrvatskoj u nekom trenutku uspostavljen konsenzus o ulasku u Evropsku uniju, na stranu sad skepticizam, na stranu šta to znači, kakva je to unija, koliko će trajati, da li će se počuvati, šta, kakav je odnos prema nekim tržišnim uslovima u njoj, diktatu, birokratiji izlistava, sve su to druga pitanja, ali na neki način se taj konsenzus prema Evropskoj uniji uspostavlja i u Srbiji, ali onda dolazi do sređivanja, odnosno potrebe da se uredi obrazovni sistem, da se deluje na sve strukture stanovništva i da se pokrenu ona pitanja o kojih postoje prirodno različita gledišta. Opšta je pretpostavka da bez ekonomske krize, bez opšte turbulencije, nekako se taj prostor političkog tržišta uredi tako da ima malo ekstremista, odnosno malo onih koji su spremni na agresivno delovanje prema političkim istomišljenicima ili prema strankima. Da li je ekonomska kriza jedini uzrok, recimo, porasta ksenofobije i u Evropi, ili makar na Balkanu, to je recimo otvoreno pitanje, mada je najlakše verovati u tako nešto. A u kontekstu ove priče o odnosu umetnosti i suočavanju sa prošlošću, ja mislim da postoji jedna zamka generalno, kada se razmišlja umetnosti, da li umetnost prostor ili polje između ostalog i političke, odnosno društvene borbe, ili je to autonomni prostor za etabliranje pre svega estetskih vrednosti, dakle nešto što je po svojoj suštinskoj prirodi različito, različit diskurs, različit fenomen i od nauke i od publicistike, a posebno od delovanja stranaka, ideologija, političkih ili ličnih interesa. To je nasleđe 20. veka i autonomija umetnosti je, rekao bih, važno dostignuće, ali ona jednostavno ne postoji kao takva. To je iluzija. Tu se ne bih sasvim složio sa Dašom. Ona kaže da ne voli plot i storije, a zapravo sve njene knjige su sastavljene od mnoštva individualnih sudbina i pojedinačnih priča koje daju na onom fakticitetu i autentičnosti građe koju Daša koristi iz prošlosti, i to je sve pitanje zašto baš tu građu koristi, a ne neku drugu. Mi možemo da zamislimo pojedinačno...
Ja se slažem, nije autorski izvedac, nije autonomno, nije.
Dobro, ali i tu postoji plot, mašta pod njim, podrazumevali. Dakle, i selekcija građe je jedan vrednostni i, ako hoćete, i politički čin samog autora, o čemu će pisati. Može o pticama, može to biti politička pesma, ali alegorijski, satirički, sve. Ja ne kažem niti tražim od pisaca, vidio sam juče iz rasprave da oni imaju jedan gard, čak i oni koji pišu na ovaj način angažovan prema tome, da i neko da zadatak ili da neko od njih očekuje i traži da pišu o određenim temama na određen način. To je naravno u redu, ali nikad ni književnost, ni umetnost nisu bile imune od uticaja društva i od potrebe da se pisac, odnosno stvaralac za svoje delo odredi prema svim aktuelnim temama, ako smatra da su bitne za njega, za društvo, ako hoćete i za budućnost. To je samo pitanje na kom nivou mi govorimo o umetnosti, o njenom delovanju. Umetnost jeste i umetnički čin, jeste i umetničko delo, jeste institucija, odnosno tako postoji u društvu i kroz reakciju kritičara i kroz, naravno, odnos finansijera i svih drugih instanci koje postoje u toj socijalnoj komunikaciji ili ustojstvu umetnosti. Tako da tu itekako ima prostora i itekako savremeni pisci deluju. Drugo je pitanje kako kritika na to reaguje, kako reaguju živi, kako reaguje država koja finansira i takve nagrade i određene festivala, da li su festivali estrada, da li su pisci zabavljači, a sa druge strane da li su u kojoj meri i na koji način mogu biti društveno aktivni, ako hoćete politički samosvesni. Nije svejedno, postoji čitav niz pitanja i to ne smeta, recimo, u Hrvatskoj, zato što većina ljudi smatra da je pitanje nacionalizma završeno, nije. Ako je broj Srba smanjen, ako su oni postali gosti, bez obzira da li dolaze kao gosti, kao ja, ili su ovde rođeni pa ne dolaze ili povremeno dolaze, to je takođe važno pitanje, da li će se vratiti, odnosno zašto neće, to je takođe važno pitanje, isto kao i pitanje položaja radnika, isto kao i odnos prema briselskoj demokratiji i birokratiji. Dakle, postoji čitav niz tema koje su same po sebi subverzivne, a koje pojedinac, ne mora da se složiti samo, čitava iz datog konteksta i na njih može reagovati i kroz tekst, u novinama, kolumnu, ali naravno i kroz svoju pesmu. Dakle, prostor je otvoren i tu sad forma, neću reći, ne igra nikakvu ulogu ili drugorazredna, ili svako odlučuje prema svom afinitetu kako će te dve stvari spojiti, a zapravo za mene lično to nisu dve stvari. I ja bih rekao da mi tako i prepoznajemo umetnike koji su nam bliski i kroz ono čime se bave, a ne samo kako to rade.
I will try to do a short summarize of long and very interesting speech. Sasha starts with the destruction of Yugoslavia, of the war in ex-Yugoslavia, and what after that, what the leading elites, how they converted the past, how they are dealing with anti-fascism, with all that that we have in heritage of Yugoslavia, from special way of socialism, anti-fascism, the language which was and it is still more or less same, and Yugoslav identity. What happened after and what is nowadays with the democratic elites in Serbia, for example, that have just, if I miss something, we just came. So that's a democratic, which is paradox in a way that after the fall of Milosevic, the nationalism started growing up in Serbia, and that all democratic elites in Serbia had kind of nationalism in their as their bottom line, as they need to have it just to can approach their voters. In that way, that we have, then he started to ask if we have consensus in the past, how can we deal with the past, and what is that everyone has their kind of their favorites from the past. Is this collaborative or even fascist in all of those democratic parties? And that is what is and all of those things which we and the Dutch also taught in her speech is all of those things that are put under the carpet. It is something that generates new fascism, new conflicts again. After that, he talked about why we have such a growth of fascism again. Is that only the economic crisis the only thing that starts to growing, or is that, or did we have something from past and then we start to have those fascism again? Then Sasha goes from all of those, how to say, more political things to the artists, and how with artists or in literature or even any kind of art is dealing with the past. Is that is art autonomous from the society or not? He's thinking that art could not be autonomous from the society, that the autonomy of the art is kind of illusion, because everything that you've done when you did something with your art is kind of political act, in a way that a collection of materials that you would be putting in or any kind of artwork is kind of political act. And what is, so he can talk about more what is position of the art and artists in the society, festivals, and could this artist needs to be active in society all ways. So then Sasha finishes that and go back to the political, to the question of the Europe, to go to the Europe, and what is disturbing Croatia, for example, that is that the question of nationalism it is of course not finished, and there is problems with certain minority, how big it is, how many people have been gone, are they all the gas? That is something that we have recently with one of very extreme right populist politics in Croatia has talked about, that is my now interpretation. What is the position of the workers? What is the position of the Brussels bureaucracy? So that is more or less everything. I try to be very briefly, but I think that Sasha put also and open also very interesting thesis. So I would like to ask Peter now, how is that in Belgium when you because you have, the Belgium is very specific country, which was very interesting that you have like more than 2 years no government or something like that. You have two big minorities, two languages, French, Flemish, and you have also Spanish, which is, so to be completely honest, not completely right. You have a collaboration with United in World War II, you have Congo that's one of what's happening in agriculture. How in that way there could be some relations with art in a way, maybe because in this way, how can you with this, how artists are doing, so we just published a house, Proof of House, for example, which is dealing with going down.
Belgium?
Yes, the sort of Belgium. So dealing with Second World War and going down to that kind of classic collaboration family. So please, could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. Belgium is interesting because and difficult because you have the rise of Flemish independence, or like a need for more Flemish autonomy within Belgium, which is steadily a Flemish movement which has been steadily gaining force throughout the 20th century, and a large part of that movement during the Second World War was tainted by collaborating with Nazi Germany because they believed that that would be the way to reach their Flemish emancipation. Now, if you there's a lot of things, and it's a very complicated history, of course, but and comparisons with the Balkans are very difficult, I think. But one thing perhaps that could be said about it is that in the current context, actually the collaboration and the response to the collaboration afterwards was also quite aggressive. This has not been actually dealt with in a profound way in society, so it's still sort of out there, and writers have tried to make it into a theme of their writing, such as Hugo Claus in the 1980s in the masterpiece The Sorrow of Belgium. So I think, I don't know what the lessons are to be drawn from that, because it goes in many directions. But what is, I think, important here in this context that I would like to emphasize, I think, is that although searching for truth and sort of going back to that difficult and traumatic past is a very complicated exercise with a lot of difficulty that it can go wrong and so on and so forth, but it's somehow not doing it is not an option. Because we've seen in history that then it comes back again, and it makes it very vulnerable then if you haven't collectively dealt with it in some sort of way. It's very vulnerable for all sorts of manipulation. And in the current political context, politicians might use, even implicitly, some of the frustration that is still present and that is not talked about, that is not brought into the open, in order to advance a very particular agenda that has nothing to do with that history in the past. So I think that's sort of the general thing I can say about it in the situation of Belgium, which is probably of use when thinking about how to deal with the more recent violent past in the Balkans. Although going back and searching for truth and will be a very difficult exercise, somehow you cannot avoid it. It's something that will have to be done in some way. And then about literature, the example of Hugo Claus is interesting because he didn't make The Sorrow of Belgium into some sort of ethical manifesto. It's a book full of stories, and you can interpret it in a lot of ways. And it's a very personal story, and it's also an exercise in style. So it's an art piece that not gives its secrets away immediately from first reading. Also, Hugo Claus was notorious for lying in his stories and in real life as well. In interviews, he would contradict himself all the time. You know, in one interview he would say one thing, and then the other interview would already be ready for the next interview, and here when he would ask the same question, he would answer completely the opposite. With a blank face. So he was making his life also, his autobiography in his interviews is also somehow invented. But he had this magical thing of being able to lie the truth somehow, so being able to point at sensitivities in society and address them, interact with them in such a way that they were felt to be authentic and they were pointing at something real. And so I think one way of seeing literature is that it somehow is a response to that need of talking about difficult parts of history, sort of making up in writing for the need, the frustration that is being felt in society, rather